Hello bibliophiles and Jane Austen fans, welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa and today I'm here to chat with you about my thoughts on Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. This month I finally finished Mansfield Park and I have to admit that right after reading it, it was not my favorite Austen novel by far. But as I mull over the book in my head and I think about it and I discuss it with others, the novel is slowly growing on me, and it's certainly one of Jane Austen's more interesting works. In case you're unfamiliar with Mansfield Park, it's about the main character, Fanny Price, who is the daughter of a large family that is not particularly wealthy, and so she's adopted when she's a child by her far richer relatives, the Bertrams, her aunt and uncle, who live in Mansfield Park. She lives with their children, Tom and Edmund, Mariah and Julia, as an outsider. When the siblings, Mary and Henry Crawford, come to town, bringing with them London glamour and a reckless taste for flirtation, Fanny's female cousins vie for Henry's attentions. And Edmund is smitten with Mary. But Fanny remains doubtful of the Crawfords and their influences, and she is more alone than ever. There's simply so much to pick apart and to discuss with this book. There's Fanny as a heroine, Fanny's relationship to Mansfield Park and her family there, the brilliant character that is Mrs. Norris, the relationship between Fanny and Mary Crawford, Henry Crawford as a potential suitor, Edmund and his treatment of Fanny. Come to think of it, this could be quite a lengthy video, so why don't you pause to grab a cup of tea or a snack or something and then come join me in a little bit. Okay, so I hope you have your cup of tea or your snack or whatever you'd like, and I'll just keep going. The actual experience of reading Mansfield Park for me was very drawn out. I picked it up in January of this year and I read a third of it before putting it aside for months. And it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying the book. It was good. I mean, it was Austen, of course. But I put it down for a few reasons. The first was simply the knowledge that this is the last of the main 6 Austen novels that I will ever read for the first time. And that thought gave me an overwhelming sense of anxiety and put this unnecessary pressure on my reading experience. I felt like I had to have the perfect reading experience and analyze every word and line and just come up with something insightful to discuss with you guys. Just knowing that I will never get the chance to read another Austen for the first time was driving me a bit crazy, and I wanted to relish the experience of reading my last Austen novel, and of course in doing so I almost ruined that experience. At some point in January, I realized that I was not having a good time reading the book at all. Not Jane Austen's fault, of course. And I stopped reading it, fully intending to pick it up again, which I obviously did. What better excuse is there to read the last of Jane Austen's main 6 novels than Jane Austen July? The other reason I think it was possible for me to put down Mansfield Park was the pacing of the book. I think of all of Jane Austen's main 6 novels, this one has the biggest issues with pacing. The first 3 chapters begin with a history of Fanny's mother and aunts and their respective marriages. Fanny arrives at Mansfield Park and ages approximately 5 years. The first 3 chapters span such a long length of time, no wonder it seemed like the other parts of the book dragged. The controversy over amateur theatrics that are performed happens within the first third of the book. Compared to the beginning of the book, the rest of the novel just seems to lag. The middle is full of Fanny's perceptions and subtle interactions with those around her, and then suddenly, at the end of the book, and I realize that I'm about to go into the kind of territory where I expect that you've either read Mansfield Park or that you don't mind having some of the plot spoiled for you. So if you do mind, I apologize. Feel free to save this video for later. I will not be offended. But going on and assuming that you are okay with me spoiling the plot or just talking about the plot as general public knowledge, at the end of the book, Fanny goes back to her family in Portsmouth, and really in the last 20 pages, everything seems to happen. The entirety of Mariah's scandal, Tom's illness, Edmund chooses his suitor, and the book rapidly concludes without skipping a beat. The pacing exacerbated my already tumultuous reading experience, but reflecting back on the pacing of the book, I think it was deliberate and actually works to emphasize Fanny's unique reserve and position as the heroine. Fanny is not the typical Austen heroine. Many readers dislike her immensely, finding her plain, boring, too moralistic, and she certainly does lack the spunk of Lizzie Bennet or Emma Woodhouse. She spends most of the book tiptoeing around as an outsider in Mansfield Park, on the verge of tears, not voicing her secret love for her cousin Edmund. But I think Fanny has her own merits and actually has more of a backbone than people give her credit for. Fanny's morality perhaps comes from her position in Mansfield Park that Mrs. Norris and the Bertram sisters do not let her forget. She's a charity case, and as such, she must work twice as hard to appear perfect and virtuous. She can't give anyone another reason to look poorly upon her in addition to her circumstances. Perhaps her reaction to the amateur theatrics is more indicative of her role in the household than her morals. Her objection to the play might be that she realizes it will be an excuse on Maria's part for open flirtation with those other than her husband. Or perhaps Fanny knows that Sir Thomas Bertram will disapprove of his daughters acting in the play. Maria, Julia, Edmund, and Tom really have little to fear from their father. I mean, what is the worst thing that will happen? A reprimanding? But Fanny just has so much more to lose. There's this pervading sense of fear that if she disappoints her benefactors, she'll be returned to the poverty which she came. And to prove that Fanny's fears and insecurities were not unfounded, that's exactly what happens when she refuses to marry Henry Crawford. She's considered a very obstinate, ungrateful girl, and is returned to her immediate family to teach her a lesson to dangle poverty as the threat of what happens if she does not comply with the Bertrams' demands. Fanny, in this way, is really just as brave as Lizzie Bennet. She's willing to reject Henry Crawford, in essence to risk losing her place in Mansfield Park in order to just have the chance of being with Edmund. Knowing what's at stake for her, that really takes guts. And in some ways, I feel like Fanny functions much like the author herself within the text. The narrator in Mansfield Park often even behaves much like the Bertrams, as if Fanny is absent. Fanny is an onlooker and an outsider. She doesn't fully participate in the world that she's a part of, but as a result, she sees things more clearly and more accurately than those who do actively participate. Like the author, she pays attention to the details, and her power of observation and insight actually become her strengths. Fanny is certainly a complex character, and I could probably go on and on about her, but I must rave about one of my favorite characters to read about, and that is Mrs. Norris. Mrs. Norris is simply despicable. She's manipulative, rude, and somehow hilarious. Here's an example of her advice to Fanny. The nonsense and folly of people stepping out of their rank and trying to appear above themselves makes me think it right to give you a hint, Fanny, now that you are going into company without any of us, and I do beseech and entreat you not to be putting yourself forward and talking and giving your opinion as if you were one of your cousins. Remember, wherever you are, you must be the lowest and the last. Frankly, this is cruel beyond reason. Mrs. Norris is the only reason Fanny is at Mansfield Park in the first place. She wanted to seem charitable by helping out her poor sister with the burden of her children, but she manages to manipulate her way out of taking any responsibility for the care of Fanny. In short, I would never want to meet Mrs. Norris. She's the worst, but she's the best to read about. I absolutely love the line that John Mullen, an eminent Austen scholar, uses to describe Maria's situation at the end of the book with regards to Mrs. Norris. He states that Maria endures the Sartrean hell of Mrs. Norris for company in the country. If hell is other people, then eternity with Mrs. Norris is the 10th circle. I'd also like to chat about Mary and Henry Crawford. They are such great characters as well. Totally different, of course, from the delights of Mrs. Norris. Mary is such a cheeky character, and I quite love her. After finishing the book, I have so many questions about her that really might only be solved by rereading the book itself. Are Mary and Fanny friends? They're rivals in the sense that they both vie for the affections of Edmund. And I do believe that any attempts at friendship on Fanny's part are really genuine. But is Mary just using Fanny to get at Edmund? I'd honestly need to reread the book to fully think about that one. And Mary is so unlike Fanny, and in many ways, like a more typical Jane Austen heroine. She superficially seems to have more in common with Lizzie Bennet or Emma Woodhouse than Fanny does. She's lively and charming and independent, but she's not the heroine of Mansfield Park, and that's the point. Yes, she's reminiscent of Austen's other heroines, but those Austen heroines change and mature throughout their books. Mary lacks Fanny's constancy and stability. If she were truly to be the heroine of this novel, she would need to change over the course of the novel, as some of Austen's other heroines tend to do. Fanny, as a character, knows herself well from a young age and isn't willing to compromise for others, and in some respects, that's what's so wonderful about this book. It's not about the main character changing over time, but rather the main character staying steady while others change and develop. Usually on the first read of an Austen novel, I am captivated by the marriage plot and the love story. But Mansfield Park was a disappointment in that respect. I frankly didn't like either of Fanny's potential suitors. Sure, I liked Edmund early on in the book, but mostly because Fanny liked him, because he made her feel secure and understood her. He's too perfect, too moralistic though. In fact, the way people criticize Fanny is actually what I think of Edmund, if that makes any sense. I liked him until I realized that he's so moralistic that he's boring and generally spineless. On the other hand, I kind of hated Henry until I realized that I maybe kind of actually liked him. He's introduced to us as a typical rake. He's flirtatious, and he decides to make Fanny fall in love with him for sport, only to eventually fall for her himself. Anyway, after that, I kind of start to find Henry Crawford almost charming. The scene where he reads Shakespeare aloud is quite lovely, but I still have plenty of issues with him as a character. It was sweet of him to use his connections to help Fanny's brother advance in the Navy, but to use that as a segue to marriage is kind of rude. It was such a lovely gesture, but does it show that he cares about her? Or rather that he wants leverage over her to sway her decision-making skills about their potential marriage? And if he really loves Fanny, how can he just run off with Maria in the end? Is he just the rake that he was introduced as, or is something else at work here? Frankly, I feel like the entire plotline of Maria running away with Henry could be better explored on both ends. In fact, it could be another entire novel from either Henry or Maria's point of view. What makes someone like Maria run away from her husband, knowing the scandal that will ensue? Is there something really there between her and Henry, or is it more that she's dissatisfied with her own marriage and looking for a fun distraction? There is just so much to think about with Mansfield Park. As much as I didn't have the greatest reading experience for the first time, part of me wants to read the book again and see if I can't look into some of these topics further. The book is just such a deep exploration of morals and social codes, and how people's actions can be informed by finances and others' expectations, as opposed to their own internal moral codes. It's about the fortitude of character in the face of external circumstances. There's just so much more to think about with this book. So I'd love to know in the comments down below, what did you think of Mansfield Park? What did you think about anything that I said? And maybe also what are some themes or questions that you think would be good to think about on a reread of Mansfield Park. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!